Hello, welcome. I see people are filtering in. Nice to see some familiar names here. All right, well, I think we will get started. My name is Rebecca Prime. I am the editor of Film Quarterly, and I must apologize. I got a cold like 2 weeks ago, and of course, it's now still making my voice a little bit raspy today, but we'll continue. Thank you so much for coming. As there's some familiar names in the audiences, so I know you're probably familiar with the journal and hopefully with our webinars, which we've been doing now since 2021. And so you'll be well aware of our commitment as a journal to expanding representation in film and media studies. And in the 6 years that I've been with Film Quarterly, we have had dossiers and webinars on topics from Asian American cinema, Arab cinema, new directions in Black film and media, the new Brazilian cinema, the new disability media, just to name a few. So you get the idea. This is prologue to saying that when our new contributing editor and columnist, Ramzi Fawaz, came to me with the idea for doing a webinar on Arab American media, I immediately said yes, because there is such a lacuna surrounding this very important area of film and media production that we felt really needed to be addressed and talked about. And so that's what we're going to do today. And I'm going to allow Ramzi to take the lead in providing more background as to the genesis of this event. But we'll just say a few words quickly to sort of address what this roundtable discussion aims to address. So I am really delighted to have with us today a fantastic lineup of scholars who are going to help us get into the weeds and discussing the stakes and some of the issues in Arab American cultural production. So starting things off, we have Ramzi Fawaz, who, in addition to his work at Film Quarterly as a columnist and contributing editor, is professor of English at University of Wisconsin-Madison. Joining him, we have Will Youmans, who is associate professor at George Washington School of Media and Public Affairs. We also have Thomas Simsarian Dolan, who is currently ACLS Emerging Voices Fellow in the Department of Middle Eastern and South Asian Studies at Emory University. And finally, we have Maytha Alhassen, who, in addition to her work as a scholar and journalist, is currently a co-executive producer of the hit Hulu show, Ramy. And Maytha, you just told me how to pronounce your last name, and I think I garbled it, so my apologies. You can correct that down the line here. So before we get going, I would just like to give everyone a few reminders about how we do things here. So first, this webinar is going to be recorded and will be available on the Film Quarterly website in about a week's time. And then it will live there in perpetuity and hopefully will be useful for teaching classes and for your own edification. Questions. We will be opening up the roundtable discussion in the last 15 minutes to the audience. So please feel free to post your questions to the Q&A, and we will do our very best to get to as many of them as possible. So without further ado, I'm going to hand things off now to Ramzi, who's going to get us started and giving some general orientation to today's discussion. Thank you, Ramzi.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. I am so thrilled to be doing this in collaboration with Film Quarterly, who've welcomed me with open arms. I'm thrilled to see so many names among the attendees of people that I adore. So thank you so much for making it out during the summer. And I'm so excited about this conversation. I wanted to give people a brief picture of what kind of motivated me to develop this idea with Film Quarterly. And I'm going to give 3 quick reasons. So those of you who might know me know that I am late 20th century American cultural studies scholar, and I focus most of my career on queer and feminist cultural production. And while I'm Lebanese American and queer, I have rarely ever studied or worked on Arab American issues. And yet, of course, in the wake of the kind of political moment that we're in, certain things have been a little bit changing for me on this front. So one of the first reasons I thought about this panel was because of the nuts and bolts of hiring within our Department of English at UW-Madison. So UW-Madison's English department has been at the cutting edge of doing hiring in global Black studies over the last 10 years. We kind of spearheaded that initiative to respond to the exigencies of the moment, to the murder of George Floyd, to Black Lives Matter. And part of those debates have been thinking about hiring people in trans studies, in Indigenous studies, and of course, we've already done a great deal of hiring in Black studies. And over those years, what I have found fascinating is that Arab American literature has never been a meaningful category in that discussion. So my colleagues, who are some of the most kind of brilliant, open-minded, extraordinary people, that never seems to be a central axis of our debate. Like whatever we call intersectionality doesn't seem to register Arab American as a problem. And so in some of our debates about hiring this last year, I vocalized my sense that I thought it was odd that in the middle of what's happening in Israel-Palestine, it had never been brought up that we should consider hiring someone in Arab American literature. So that was one thing. I was like, why is that category so evanescent, so not apparent to people? The second is that in all of the public discourse on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, it's been amazing to me the lack of language of conversation about Arab American cultural politics and cultural influence on the United States. There is very little discussion about Palestinian art, film, the influence of Arab food on American culture. I mean, Americans are obsessed with Arab foodways. And yet the discussion is primarily about the political and on the ground violence that's happening, which it should be. And yet there is not so much of a discussion about the role that Arab American culture plays in shaping and transforming American lives. And so that incredible disconnect between the fact that Americans like love to eat hummus and love to go to Arabic, like Lebanese restaurants, and yet can't seem to link that reality to the political world that's happening, you know, abroad, kind of shocked me. And I felt the same way as I was developing a course on Arab American literature and popular culture, just the lack of movies that I could find or documentaries, the lack of, you know, just representation was shocking to me as a popular culture expert. And the last thing I'll say before I wrap up is that I became obsessed during my sabbatical with the work of Edward Said. As I watched things unfold at the Columbia campus, I thought to myself, why don't we read Edward Said's work beyond Orientalism? The man wrote 20 books. They're astonishing works of literature, political, cultural politics. He wrote about everything. And he was an incredibly cosmopolitan Arab American thinker. He was deeply anti-identitarian. He did not simply think of himself as Palestinian. He thought of himself as an exile from every culture that he went to. He had this incredibly broad, rigorous vision that I would say goes completely against the contemporary interdisciplines. He would be horrified with what's happened in Black studies, in ethnic studies, the incredible retrenchment into identity, the incredible retrenchment into negativity, into Afro-pessimism. He would be so against all of that. And so I really wanted to kind of create a forum for us to talk in a cosmopolitan way about Arab American cultural production. So that's kind of the broad overview of my thinking.
Well, I love that. Thank you so much, Ramzi. I think that's such an important reminder about Edward Said's work. Next up, I'm going to pass things over to you, Will, to tell us a bit about what you're thinking about these days and what you're hoping we'll talk about today.
Thank you so much for having me. I had to prepare my comments because I only have 5 minutes and I would not be able to limit myself to 5 minutes if I wasn't prepared. So forgive me for reading. I'm really focusing on sort of the historical background of the present in terms of Arab American media. So for Arab Americans of a certain age, those of us who recall the 1980s and 1990s, we were shaped deeply by a media age of relentlessly demeaning representations. From children's programming to soap operas to films to the news, anything that had Arab in it in U.S. media was reductively derogatory, hurtful for us to witness, a reminder of a positionality from the margins. Certain generations of Arab Americans, I think, will just always be in conversation with that legacy. That's not to say that the youth will be as much. A pioneer Arab American media researcher named Jack Shaheen cataloged over 1,000 films and television episodes from these industries' earliest days until about 2000. He found a predominance of negativity. 937 of these depictions were damaging, to be exact. Pictures of Arabs as oppressive sheiks, oil barons, suppressed and submissive women, and arch terrorists have become sedimented in America's popular imagination in the time that Shaheen was writing. These were hard to recognize as Arab Americans, these pictures, these representations, but the message was clear. These were the pictures of a people who only knew how to be dominating or dominated, and who were in need of freeing. They were to be feared and yet pitied, to be loathed as creatures espousing primitive hatred. Drawing on Shaheen's scholarship, the Arab American multimedia artist and filmmaker Jackie Saloom made a short film called Planet of the Arabs and released it in 2003. It's still online. I recommend you look it up. The 9-minute video mixes footage from scores of movies and television programs to create a trailer-like montage documenting Hollywood's relentless vilification and dehumanization of Arabs and Muslims. There's this rich tradition of Arab American media speaking back to these representations, and Saloom's film follows this history, blending sort of media advocacy, self-aware media making by the community. In my own archival work, and I'm building an archive around the LA-based television program Arab American TV, which ran out of Los Angeles 1980 to 2005, I found this old segment where the hosts of the show screened anti-Arab Hollywood films, but then would have a running commentary where they provided critical narration over the actual film clips that they showed. The commentator's face would appear in a little circle on the screen as the film played. It was a chance for them to sort of speak back to what the mainstream industry was producing. Now, Arab American media and lots of cultural production is in the tradition of immigrant and diasporic media and cultural production, doing several things for the communities that they serve. They were bridges to the homeland, a forum for Arab Americans or immigrants to articulate themselves as a community, a place that could maintain culture, maintain language, but also help acclimate newcomers to larger society and polity. In the Arab American context, many like AATV saw themselves as self-representation against this tide of American media with its othering ways. But sitting here, speaking of these old logics, I cannot help but feel antiquated. Today's age defined by multiplicity, by media coming from all different angles, media are everywhere, creators are everybody. These old stereotypes that Shaheen documented seem representative of a bad old days. Functions of ethnic media feel so passé to talk about in an age of transnationalism, of social media influencers, new media entities, of ever enriching flows from all over the world. Perhaps we're seeing the weakening power of old gatekeepers. I know this is a theme other speakers will be presenting today. Arab American media are finally becoming mature enough, it seems, to not have to speak back to the mainstream media anymore. Their goal is to self-narrate warts and all without being defensive or feeling the burden of having to be representative of this misconstrued, misrepresented community. There are greater possibilities for creation than ever, and in ways that seem somewhat difficult to imagine only several decades ago. In Saloom's Planet of the Arabs, she ends with the clip from the movie Network from 1976. That movie was about a raving network news anchorman who turns against television itself and critiques society writ large. In the last scene of her film, Saloom's film, there's a clip of the anchorman screaming, a monologue where he calls on the audience to turn off their televisions. I think Saloom was saying that we must reject all of this. But nowadays, turning off the media is not so much the answer as it is becoming or being the media, expressing cultures on our own terms. So those are just some of my thoughts about the historical context that we're still in the shadow of, I think, of the 80s and 90s. And as we think about the present moment, how much are we sort of breaking from this past?
Well, thank you so much, Will. And that was 5 and 14 seconds. So you timed yourself very, very well. All right, Thomas, let's see if you can do as well as sticking to the time limit.
Great, thank you. I will be brief because I really do want to leave time for Q&A and discussion amongst all the other, esteemed panelists. Um, so like Ramzi and Will, I thought about Orientalism and I thought about history. I'm trained as a historian, although I came to academia via another path as a performer. So in thinking about today, I was reminded of Edward Said, and again, kudos. Please read more than just Orientalism, and don't just cite Orientalism and think that you've understood the Middle East, because you have not. Um, that's a particular pet peeve. But in thinking about Edward Said, I'm reminded of a few kind of key concepts that he's interrogating: power, representation, and particularly the concept or the idea of a permission to narrate. And I bring this up to echo Will because it seems to me, in thinking about certainly to age myself, the 80s and the 90s, and knots when I grew up, but even earlier, for a long time, it was not so much that there was a lack of representation, but there was a surfeit of a particular kind of representation that, as Will has shown, was so negative. You know what I mean? That obscured earlier iterations that have their pitfalls as well. I'm thinking of like Danny Thomas and Uncle Tonus. Like were actually earlier iterations, but incredibly normative bourgeois, suburban, middle class ideas of Arabness, that in that case were produced by Arab Americans, but for a broader public. So growing up, of course, we saw these incredibly negative representations, and a data point that I've taught with a million times is that as late as 2015, nearly a quarter of Americans supported bombing Agrabah, which is, the fictional city in Disney's Aladdin, right? So as a rejoinder to those in culture who say, well, representation doesn't really matter. I mean, this isn't reality. Well, no, I think part of Edward Said's major insight is like, no, that representation is so tethered to power and real geopolitical processes, the law, social habitus, that we cannot argue that representation doesn't matter. So to also echo Will, what I think has changed and what I'm excited for in recent years is increasing activism, and space for possibility. Again, with pitfalls that I do want us to think about, right? Like we have still representations that are invested in claiming sort of normative identities and proper middle class Americanness, as a means for inclusion. We've seen a groundswell of activism around the new MENA category, and I want to talk a bit about that. So the federal government announced, cynically, I think, as a way to try to placate Middle Eastern, Arab, North African voters, who are furious about what's happening in Israel-Palestine, and offered sort of dangled this carrot of, well, here, you'll have a MENA category for the first time. But I do think that offers a lot of possibilities for organizing and will mandate that there is more positive representation. A lot of, though, what the activism among performers and creatives is not about opportunity, because as I said, there's been so much opportunity, but it's about understanding what real opportunity equity would look like, right? And particularly empowering people to be in decision-making positions in creative industries. So they're not just playing terrorist number 3 or hot dog vendor number 2, but that they actually have control over the means of production and can then create more complex, more interesting representations. And I guess the last thing I wanted to say there was, again, that there's some pitfalls there. I think particularly around the identitarian turn that Ramzi pointed to. We can't understand representation as being an emancipatory politics in and of itself. We can't understand identity politics or identitarian turns as being emancipatory. And I think so often what we have to navigate, or what we're threading the needle here, is there's an investment in DEI, SAG, AFTRA, Actors Equity, the Screen Actors Guild, the Writers Guild, all created a MENA category years ahead of the federal government. That's great. That shows that media industries are interested in diversity. But I would caution us against understanding kind of DEI as it's been industrialized and kind of capitalized as being the answer in and of itself, right? Because so often it falls into exactly the pitfalls that Ramzi pointed to of identity standing in for expertise, or just someone being in the room as standing in for equity or decision-making power, or doing more than just what's often a cosmetic 11th hour Band-Aid, for a lot of cultural products. Happy to go into specifics, but I'll stop there.
That was great. Thank you so much, Thomas. And lots of food for thought there. That is also a perfect segue to our next panelist, Maytha. And Maytha, say your last name for me, please.
Alhassen.
Alhassen. Thank
Yeah.
you.
But I'll say in an American inflection, Alhassen. But yeah, Alhassen is the Arabic.
Okay. And so Maytha is going to be able to speak because you have experience sort of on both sides, both the scholarship and then as a cultural producer. So we're very excited to have your perspective today.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I think the bigger challenge than shifting the norms in TV and film and media lit large is condensing my comments to 5 minutes. I have a history. I came into the space, ironically, through my work as a community organizer. I worked on the MENA category in 2010. We had this campaign, Check It Right If You Ain't White, Check It Right, You Ain't White. And then I also worked around academic reports, insights. I did a lot of these 101s on after 9/11, who are Arabs, who are Muslims, and I would traditionally start those conversations with clips that Will has mentioned, that Thomas has mentioned. And somebody came up to me afterwards when I gave a talk in Cleveland and said, "Oh, you're from LA. That's why you started out with Hollywood." And I said, "Is there any other way to start this conversation about the overdominance, the hegemony of how we're understood and consumed?" And so I got this opportunity to do this. I overburdened myself. 100-year history inspired by Jack Shaheen of representations of Muslims, and I broke it down by gender and racial category, and it mapped on to some very interesting tropes and stories. In the early period, it was something I called the mystical Moor that was aligned to Noble Savage. But then I was doing this sweeping coverage of representation, and as the panelists had discussed, it's an interesting dynamic to enter a space where you then create the art with this notion of percentages around storytelling. And there's other problematics that I encountered when I went on the other side. And I went on the other side because I was actually just like lightweight consulting Ramy as a creative advisor for the first season of Ramy. And then the second season, I became a staff writer. Third season, I was a co-executive producer. And actually, you know, if we don't have a chance to, in my comments, go around and into this, I would love to talk about our Palestine episode in season 3. Was highly controversial with the diaspora in ways it wasn't in the quote unquote Middle East Swana area. And I have some ideas of what that is and what diasporic identities around like white middle class norms are. And actually where I want to start my comments is around that, which is, I think, our biggest problematic with what's going on in the region, with how we're talking about representation, is the striving for humanization. And humanization, I tack onto, or I understand it in the tradition of like a Sylvia Wynter, is this colonial framework. It's the schema of subject, of adequate subject and non-subject. And I actually take my cues from indigeneity or Indigenous American studies around four-leggeds, even Arabic understandings of human as the one who forgets, insan, to push back against the ways that we strive for what becomes actually proximity to white approval. And that's actually what is meant when we say we just need to humanize them. We have to make them palatable to this white proximity. And I'll give you some examples that are really clear on TV and film, or have happened in the process. So when Ramy was testing out the first episode, the pilot, to a sample group of folks, they had different versions of the beginning. One was a call to prayer. Another one was starting out the conversation with him and his mother in the car. And when they heard the call to prayer, they thought it was a show about terrorism, the call to prayer. Second thing that I want to leave you with is when Ramy was shopping around the show, and sorry if there's no background noise, right? When Ramy was shopping around the show, some big networks responded to his characterization of a story. Oh my God, I'm so sorry. Can you hear it or no?
No, it's fine.
Okay, great. responded to his depiction of an Egyptian Palestinian family in Jersey on the search for what does God mean? What's the God-shaped hole that we carry with ourselves? And asked if they could have white neighbors to be able to understand any kind of redeemable dignity for our communities had to be done so through the white gaze. And yeah, we'll pick up from there, but I think that that's one of the things I'm more interested in, is how we transcend this humanization normative framework that we feel like is a popular lean to think through how we ameliorate, quote unquote, these images or our standing in Hollywood.
Thank you so much, Maytha. I think I'm so excited for this conversation just from these introductory remarks. We are starting to get questions into the Q&A, which we'll do after our roundtable, but I just want to mention one that wasn't a question so much as a clarification about the MENA census category. Someone wrote that this has been in the works for much longer than the immediate context of the October 7th attacks. And just so vis-a-vis it being, just to give sort of credit to the years of work that have gone into establishing that category. So,
So I want to
Ramzi.
clarify, because I realize that's my bad. I don't mean to diminish that decades of work that have gone into this category, but just that because its announcement came as such a surprise to even partner organizations, the scuttlebutt among many people was that it was a somewhat cynical move. But yeah, I do not mean to diminish all the work that has been done by people on the panel as well.
Yeah, and as that is when it was approved. Ramzi, I know you had some questions to sort of start us off with.
Thank you all. This is so rich. That's just like, even those little snippets were so rich. And I just developed 3 questions, which I think are going to open out into so many different avenues. And the first already speaks to all the different strands that you guys have kind of pulled out. I'm wondering, what are some of the traditional frameworks that exist for understanding the unique or distinct qualities of Arab American experience? And how do those frameworks both kind of like contain the categories representation and also offer possibilities? And what I mean by that, right, is that if we look at ethnic studies histories, it's like there's always the rote history of certain forms of marginalization. Asian Americans struggle with the model minority myth, which I think also extends to Arab Americans, right? African Americans deal with the legacy of slavery in the wake of slavery. And of course, those are not the only histories that each of those groups has, but there is a kind of rote story that is narrated about the distinct or unique struggle of a particular group of people. I'm wondering what you think distinguishes the Arab American experience or connects it to some of those other experiences, and what have been kind of the limits or possibilities of trying to articulate that experience in various media forms, kind of in contemporary popular culture.
It's too difficult of a question. Pass. I mean, some of my own work, I'm looking around concepts of citizenship. And I've been inspired by some of the work I found in the archives that I'm working on, where like during the 1990 Gulf War, which was, one of a long series of US wars in the Middle East, there was a Japanese American organization that was very prominent in its solidarity with the American community and was really vocal in raising concerns about the potential for there being like an internment camp, because there was, in the late 80s, there was a governmental proposal for an internment camp in Louisiana that was leaked, and Arab American TV was sort of publishing it. And this is part of, along with an assortment of various legal cases against particularly Arab American activists, this really mobilized the Japanese American civil rights organizations on the West Coast. But I think when I talk about citizenship, I'm referring to kind of being citizens during times of war or conflict, where citizens are sort of like these domestic foreign bodies, where they're made to sort of stand in for the targets of the war. And so moments of like great patriotism and nationalism that happens around wars also tends to entail a vilification of people who are sort of representative of whoever the war is against. So our American community had been like in this position more or less since the 1970s, when Nixon started the war on terrorism, following really the wake of the 1967 war, where like certain Arabs were just perpetually becoming the enemy. And that's when the media stereotype of Arab as enemy really comes about. It's more or less so it's been in place for about 50 years, where Arab American citizenship is always cast as in terms of securitization, in terms of suspicion. And there was this book by Nadine Neighbor and Amani Jamal, and basically it says in the subtitle of the book, it's Arab Americans post 9/11 from invisible subjects to visible citizens or somebody, but it plays with this trope of invisibility to visibility. But with that visibility came increasing suspicion. So I think that those are some of the frameworks that interest me the most in terms of the Arab American studies.
Yeah, jumping off of that, I think what was so crucial for me in entering Arab American studies was Nadine Neber's article, Ambiguous Insiders, Insiders, yes, where she discusses the history of this invisibility, hypervisibility framework, and also tracks what is happening in the Middle East, Swana area, as affecting the policies or the political subjecthood of Arab Americans. And also, oh my God, was it Hagopian or was it Samhan that wrote about political racism towards our community?
I think Samhan.
Samhan, yes. And describing the precise or the unique nature of the kind of racism that Arab Americans experience. I also think about the shifting category of Arab, and that's something that is either perplexing us or haunting us or making the complexity actually more rich. When we work with the archives, we're also thinking about moments when folks are just categorized as Syrian or Turkish because they're coming from the Turkish Empire. I love to rile up Lebanese folks when I tell them that I call Khalid Gibran Syrian. But I mean, this was Balad al-Sham at this time period. So we're still struggling with this long history, but I would also say another framework that I'm thinking through, I mentioned it briefly in the remarks, is, and thinking again also about what Saeed offers in terms of the exile and the diaspora. I think in this moment, the administration is trying to understand us as being able to be assimilable as Arab Americans distinct from our region. And I think that's a very bad calculus that they saw in the primary trail, which was that, thank you to WhatsApp, thank you to so many different ways to stay connected, the Atlantic Ocean doesn't exist in terms of the separation or this idea of a gulf between us and what's happening abroad. So I think that's another framework that I manage through. And I love Edward Said, but I would critique the categorization around Orientalism as almost this sort of brown character trope, because when you actually go back and look at the imagery, you do see North African, African Black folks. And I've thought of this earlier era as a mystical Moor that maps onto this noble savage sort of history. So we're also contending with that fetishization that again extends. I mean, we talked about Hamas, we talked about Ramzi, you brought this up in the comments, that thread of continuing to be desirable for almost the same reason that indigenous folks are, is the ability to cannibalize us, is kind of also part of our legacy and history that I think still needs to be unraveled.
Yeah, I mean, this is so rich. And again, I'm so grateful to be in a group of folks who are thinking through so many similar things. I was just going to add, I think that to echo these things and complement them, I think it's, again, this sort of Faustian bargain with categorization, right? You know, what I'm often struck with is the idea that there is templates, racial templates or racial scripts, you know, that were built largely on Black and then Indigenous peoples and then are mobilized and applied nonsensically to apply to all different kinds of people, right? So I think that we are almost doing us a disservice by suggesting there's a taxonomy that we just need to figure out where we fit and then respond to it and then dismantle that, because what racism is this constantly modulating form of power that can mobilize any script, mutually incoherent, nonsensical, you know what I mean? Like you're somehow super rich, but also a poor refugee. And like, so in other words, I think that there is a way that we must contend with race and the ambiguous racialization of peoples, because the way that Americans try to understand the world is always through this racial, I would argue, a racial lens, you know, but that maps onto what I've tried to theorize as geopolitical stature, that sutures these sort of domestic and foreign policy concerns and narrows the distance in ways that particularly for MENA communities, because they're at the fore of, you know, the linchpin of U.S. foreign policy in many ways. We can't separate, you know, here, there, past, present are much more closely, I think, and intimately connected, you know.
And Maytha, I know you had another comment you wanted to add.
Oh, really quickly, because I do think it maps on to what's happening right now, is we do have like a killer kids trope, which feels not as unique. Of course, we have the targeting of Black children and trying to present them as adults, but there's a way that we are culturally defined as being embedded with a kind of violence that's irredeemable, and that we are producing generations of hate and danger. Again, I just throw to American Sniper, when an Iraqi kid was seen as a major challenge and threat to a well-trained American military. And of course, Rules of Engagement, which had the most preposterous disabled, like Yemeni girl is also threatening the American embassy.
Yeah, and the discourse of that was, you know, could civilians sort of be justifiably killed if they're perceived as posing a threat, and it's, you know, this kind of war propaganda justification that's really being a sort of dominant trope today. When we talk about Israel and Gaza.
Yeah, and it's decades in the making. I think that's the point of why it feels so frustratingly hard to upset or unsettle in current media.
I just want to actually add something to that as a non-expert. I mean, as I'm developing, just basically barely scratching the surface of preparing for this course I'm going to teach about a topic that isn't my specialty, right? But it's just that I'm bringing my expertise in popular culture to Arab American issues. I've been surprised by the idea that like there's an early version of the Arab American immigrant in the late 19th century, usually Syrian, that is completely occluded by what happens after 1950. All of the stuff that Melanie McAllister writes about in her book Epic Encounters, right, is really about a huge shift after 1950, where the Middle East becomes a major source of angst for the US, which wants to dominate and control the region. But what's interesting is that like the earlier version of the Syrian immigrant is really somebody who's interested in bringing modernity to the Middle East. Like you're talking about people who came to work for the Ford plant, who like really wanted to bring ideas of American entrepreneurship, technological innovation. When Edward Said writes his autobiography, he writes about his father coming to the US and then to Canada and being pretty obsessed with American independence, individualism, like values that we tend to think of as like antithetical to Middle East culture, and bringing those values back in order to start a very successful business. And what's interesting to me is like that's yet another narrative that is like not really told, right? That there is also a genuine desire of Middle East immigrants to bring the culture of the United States like into conversation with everyday life in the Middle East, that we then have to, in the terms of, you know, anti-Arab racism, we have to then present Arab Americans as atavistic, anti-modernist, you know, et cetera, when in fact there's a long history of like a deep desire to be in a conversation with what this new country was, you know, and that's so fascinating to me. And it says something about needing to multiply the narratives around race and racialization rather than try and find one story. It's like about needing to actually like tell a million stories.
Have you thought about the Boston Pen League much, and Khalil Gibran and Amin Rehani and the sort of innovations they made to Arabic poetry, based on the kind of poetry that they were getting exposed to in New York and Boston? I mean, that's kind of a perfect example of that. But I think of that as like an alternative universe where the United States doesn't become an empire after World War II and doesn't feel like the world is its geopolitical playground, and where there isn't this oil dependency that defines the U.S. relationship to the Middle East. You might have a completely different sort of history of the Arab American immigrant community, but even by the 1890s, you're still seeing geopolitics play out in the Arab American community through, for example, like Ottoman agents going against dissidents, Arab nationalists in places like New York, for example. But then in the 1910s, the 1920s, Arab activists opposing Zionism and trying to convince Congress of opposing Zionism. So there are little seeds of this sort of the political role of the U.S. in the world playing out. But without that turn after World War II, without World War II, maybe we'd be having a very different conversation, I think.
Yeah, so I'm executive producing an American Muslims History Revealed docuseries with PBS Digital, and one of our stories is of this Syrian migration to the Dakotas that ends up happening in late 19th, early 20th century. And we follow one family that's responsible for the first mosque, which is in the Dakotas at the time, and gets rebuilt. But we follow this whole history, and I think it's actually quite fraught there's a little bit of a conversation, but I think, again, this is another opportunity. I wish I had grad students because I would point them, please go do this. But there's definitely discussions around steppe migration. So we were going through Mexico, the Mexican Revolution shifted things, and then people came through the border. There's a fascinating Lebanese cartel drug story in Texas that I think they're doing an adaptation about. I interviewed for it. It is literally the most amazing story I've ever heard, but it came from a family that had that moved from Mexico to Texas because of the revolution. There are Syrians that came through Jamaica, some that stayed there, and then people that went back and forth, including Khalil Gibran's family, as you mentioned, Ramzi, and then landed back. So this is a story of Mary Juma. But what we argue is there's also a way that Syrian migrants and other migrants are used as settler colonial tools because they came here and in response to the Homesteading Act, or one of many homesteading acts. And they didn't understand the racial politics of genocide to indigenous land that required them to displace indigenous folks, to have this so-called American opportunity, this American dream that was somebody else's nightmare. And again, then they're inducted into the racial politics of being perceived as anything but white, and how that, as you mentioned, Thomas, mapped for white supremacists on as Black, especially in the South, with burning crosses and lynching some Syrians that had dry foods, grocery stores in the South as well. So there's all these dynamics happening at the same time, even with the drive for this sort of American capitalist dream to, quote unquote, modernize. I mean, also, what's so strange during the mandate state system, Syria in particular and other countries requested the US be their protectorate instead of France and Britain as well. So there were understandings because the US did not hold this imperial status, as Will had discussed, to the degree that the French and the British did, that there could be a little bit more fairness in releasing them from the clause of imperialism.
Can I want to just, in the interest of time, I'm going to combine my last two questions so that we have time also for Q&A. I am wondering what you think accounts for the dearth of Arab American cultural production outside of literature, if you believe that that's even true, right? My own view when I was doing research for my teaching is that I can find a lot of literary production. There's a lot of Arab American novels, poetry, compared to Asian American, African American, not even close. But there's still, that seems to be the field where there's the most expansive production. And yet it was much harder for me to find television, film, etc. I'm wondering what you think accounts for that. Again, if you think it does, do you think that there are avenues in which that is being transformed now, whether it's through social media, etc.? And the last question I was going to ask is, what is your method, each of you, for studying Arab American cultural production? Like, what is the method by which you know, I know one of you does archives, one of you does cultural production, like what is the method by which one could actually study Arab American cultural production so that all of these kind of rote narratives that we have might actually be broken?
And I will just say before we get started, because that you combined, there's still 2 questions in there.
Yeah,
So
true.
we have 13 minutes left. We have a few questions in the Q&A. So, you know, Ramzi, we may not be able to explore all dimensions of that question.
I'll try to be brief in thinking, you know, I love this framing, and I would love to do a real thought experiment, you know, with all of you of like, what would have happened had the US not moved as it did? And this is where like Usama Makdisi and Rashid Khalidi, in some ways, I think in their scholarship are thinking like, there was a lot of misplaced faith in the US among all kinds of Mina and Swana peoples, you know, that it wasn't going to be an empire in the way that it really did. I bring that up because I think that we might offer an alternate kind of history or genealogy of production. And this is, though, comes back to my first comment. We have to think about who is creating this and for whom. I've taught, and I'm kind of obsessed with a 1920 Broadway show and 1923 movie, Anna Ascends, that's about like what we would call a Lebanese immigrant who comes to the States, works really hard, marries her white boss, learns English, and, you know, the villain is trying to steal an Oriental rug, you know, from her beau's house, right? And he's a bad Syrian, right? So I bring that up not to say that we want to invest in these incredibly normative tropes about whitewashing and upward mobility and things like that, but just to say that an object like that to me points to the incredible constructedness of any kind of racialization. And it speaks to a moment where, again, the way that the US thought about the Middle East was entirely different, right? And I think that can be useful to destabilize and show just how much production is being underwritten by geopolitical concerns. So to answer then, I think your second question about like, I don't know why necessarily just literature. I was thinking there are a number of literary lights also in Latin America, you know what I mean, in Arab, you know, Latinos who are writing and are really, really quite celebrated. I mean, like the female kind of most celebrated poet in Colombia is Mayra del Mar, who is Arab American and is Shakira's like great aunt or something, right?
Mhm.
So I bring that up to say that I don't have an easy answer, but I think we would be naive not to point to the incredible pressures that the US government has been able to bring to bear on the culture industries, you know, and foreclose certain kinds of things as being completely verboten. You know, I'm also struck that, not for nothing, there is a ton of Arab American organizing in the 20s and 30s around Palestine. It's been completely occluded because it doesn't fit within a narrative, in part advanced by Edward Said, that there were no Arab Americans before they realized that they were Arab in 1967, or in 48, or in, you know, 17, right? These kind of weird watershed moments, I think, are constructed and harmful. But these organizations already in the 30s and 40s faced intense pressure and charges of anti-Semitism if they were anti-Zionist. So I think that in that way, this racial script or this kind of discourse is really, really, really old. And we have to be quite cynical in dismantling it, because I think this is a major part of why the major culture industries, right, have foreclosed representations of Arabs, because to even be is understood as being anti-Semitic, which of course is nonsensical in 8,000 different ways, as we know. Methodology, scavenger methodology. I'm like, I'm a scavenger. I will read this. I'll find this clip. I live on YouTube. I'm totally mixed methods, I think, to try to tell a fuller story.
Scavenger, I like that. Maytha?
Oh yeah, this thing. And some of you know, this company, and you're on the laptops, was created by somebody who's half Syrian, Steve Jobs, but also sorry, now you saw a picture of me and my mom as a baby. This was developed by a Lebanese American, the iPhone. So every way that we understand now production, cultural production through a much more, a less of an industrial format, is thanks to Arab Americans who had produced this technology for us, right? So I think there's a way, extending Thomas's argument of occlusion, that we are occluded from both being responsible for giving the technology, for creating the technology, and being on the other side. I think we're a victim of early attempts in the 20th century to transform our racial category into that of Caucasian, into whiteness, because then we get understood for much of that history until there's this 1960s turn where a lot of quote unquote white ethnics, and there's this ethnic revival that happens, and also later inspired by roots. According to some Arab Americans talking about methodology that I've interviewed, said roots was an opportunity for them to go and find who they were. Because if you peel back a lot of these folks, again, not just the Steve Jobs and whatnot, one of the most well-known surfers, Kelly Slater, has Syrian ancestry. Like you can find all of these elements of people's connection to quote unquote Arab America, whatnot. But I also wanted to say that even in TV and film, you know, it goes back to quote unquote how we are either imagined or unimagined. Luis Valdez, who came out of Teatro Campesino in the Bay Area, wrote this play called Zoot Suits. And in Zoot Suits, the lawyer who's defending the group of Chicanos that are on trial, unfairly on trial, he writes as an Irishman, George Shearer. It's actually a Syrian man named Shibli. Yeah, Shibli. So, and then again, you know, not to take this even further, but Erin Brockovich also was an Arab American lawyer, becomes a white benevolent lawyer instead. So white benevolence kind of erases us in this history, or white male benevolence. I would say that, yeah, there's just more archival digging we need to do about who we are, how we had been erased. And, you know, when I just talk to students, they tell me their grandparents or their great-grandparents are Syrian. So it's just kind of a shocking sort of genealogy that we lack.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to interrupt here with a question that's come in because we have about 5 minutes left, but I think it actually relates very closely to what you've just been talking about. So this is from Catherine Benamou. Are there currently efforts in Hollywood to fortify specifically Arab American casting and representation?
There is, Thomas, you want to talk about the Middle East actors group? I mean, I don't know the actors group as well. Are you a part of them?
Yeah, so I was going to say a few things that, I mean, there are a few initiatives. I think that, as I said, fortunately, many studios, as well as like the guilds, the unions, were much more interested in being more inclusive earlier than the federal government, which meant that there were pushes to, for example, make, you know, most studios will have diversity showcases, you know, and say, oh, we actually should be including, you know, MENA or SWANA talent within them. Even prior to the federal government, there are organizations like the MENA Arts Advocacy Coalition, with whom I work. The Pillars Fund is created. It's a Muslim specific, you know, casting. There are a number of initiatives that exist that are trying to tackle this problem and basically address what is often falsely framed as a pipeline problem. You know, like, I mean, I literally had a friend, you know, say, oh, I just don't know if I've ever met anyone Middle Eastern, you know, and this is a, you know, working actress. And I said, okay, you just don't know that you've met someone Middle Eastern because they have maybe faced pressure to change their name, or they weren't interpolated as such, or, you know, whatever. So I think there's a lot of effort to say, okay, there's not actually a pipeline problem. There are a lot of performers. They just need to be uplifted and understood as what they are. But and maybe that's a short way of answering. I don't know, maybe do you have any other things to?
Yeah, the Middle Eastern Writers Group had also surveyed our population of writers, and I believe determined that 0.3 or 0.8% of writers in the WGA are from the Middle Eastern descent, or identifies Middle Eastern. So that number rocked the industry. But I think a big challenge that rarely gets talked about, and maybe goes back to Ramzi's earlier question, is IP. So frequently I'm in meetings where people have IP for a lot of terror trope things. And my reps will tell me to take the meeting, and I'll explain why I won't do anything within a terror trope unless it's got like Tony Soprano, Michael Corleone, mafia vibes that knows how to flip something. And most of it is New York Times articles, profiles. Sometimes it's books. And so I would encourage anybody on here, especially if they're mentoring folks. I do think there is a renaissance happening, yes, in literature and music, but if we flood the space with IP, even just like simple memoirs, that's an opportunity to tell different stories, because that's also a tried and tested capitalist film industry formula for something being successful. I'm actually working on something that also is IP, and it is an Arab American story that did go viral. So that, again, that's an example of how to really shift this landscape if you're interested in making that intervention.
This is not a question, but just a comment from Christian Peterson. Shanila Koja Molji's, sorry, my pronunciation, the impossibility of Muslim boyhood speaks about a lot of these threads and should be great for teaching, short, engaging, and readable. So I'm not sure if that's a text you're familiar with, but putting that out there. We actually don't have any more questions. So audience, this is your last 2 minutes if you have final questions. Otherwise, I just sort of get back to you, Maytha, with your in your initial remarks, you spoke about the Palestine episode in Ramy, and I'm not giving you enough time to talk about it, but perhaps you could just to say a little bit about
It's like my favorite episode of the whole series.
Thank
and
you.
I'm obsessed with the whole series, but I was my mom and I were watching it and we were like, OMG, we were freaking out.
The frequent critique, especially from Arab Americans, is why did the kid do something to incite a response from Ramy? And so again, within this humanization framework, somebody has to be actually unhuman, be inherently good, to be the polar opposite of the terror, violent, enemy, foreign, other trope. Otherwise, it is not palatable, or it is something that gives folks anxiety about allegedly, and this is where the white gaze becomes so predominant, because it's the fear of how they could possibly see us as messy, or being like anybody else, being ruffled up and then responding back by beating Ramy up for stealing a bike because he's this American imperial force, right? That he could do that. So that's the kind of pushback we got. But interesting enough, we had a full Palestinian production. When we were there, Shireen Abu Akleh, when we were doing our scouting, was murdered. And actually, we had this big challenge of getting kids in who were cast in our episode from Jeanine's Freedom Theater to get a permit to come into 48 where we were filming. And then again, she was murdered, and a lot of people in our cast and crew knew her. We actually went to her wake in Jerusalem as a crew. Yeah, I could say so much about this episode. And Hiam Abbas came on as a consulting producer, and she would just tell me the most remarkable things. Her family is from Haifa, was displaced from their village, about just even the landscape and the land in Palestine that I still hold very close today. And the way our crew just miraculously made things happen, because they're just, in the Arabic words of shatar or shatra or shatura, they found a way to make that episode happen, and somehow it did. Love to have another conversation about it.
Yeah. Oh, we are unfortunately out of time. So now I'm like, oh, we should have made this a 1.5-hour webinar. So much more to be said, and I'm sure the conversation will continue. But thank you all so much for attending, and thank you to our audience for showing up during summertime. And please don't forget to look out for the webinar on our filmquarterly.org website in about a week. So thanks so much. Bye, everyone.